and welcome, Steph. Okay, so let's see. Is there any other? So, we're starting here in January some new family to family classes, some new peer-to-peer classes. We have several support groups that we have all week long. We have a Monday night support group for families, a Wednesday night support group for families, a Wednesday night for peer to peer, Thursday night support group for families, Saturday morning support group for families. And we have these free 8-week classes for peers who have some mental health challenges and for family members who there was an amazing article in the front page of the LA Times on Sunday. I don't know how many of you see it. If you didn't see it, you should see it. It was on the front page, and it took 4 pages of the LA Times,
Mm.
talking about this very handsome young man who became mentally ill, once he got out of high school, and he had 9 siblings, and the length that the siblings went to take care of him, and
Mhm.
he decompensated so much when he wasn't around a sibling, and his entire life till he died was jail, homelessness, jail,
Mm.
residential treatment where he'd walk away from, homelessness, and the siblings took food to him, they visited him in jail, they encouraged him, they got him in touch with psychiatrists, psychologists. He really was provided mental health treatment. And it was such a beautifully written article, and I was proud of the LA Times for focusing on this issue at this level. That finally the stigma is being broken, and newspapers are talking about it, important people are talking about it. So, perhaps things will improve for mentally ill people because the stigma is definitely lessening. So,
Mhm.
if you can find that article, I recommend you read it. So, without further ado, I want to introduce you to our illustrious and very talented and sensitive speaker tonight. Her name is Dr. Karen Wilson, and she is a pediatric neurologist. She is the founder of something called Nexus, Nexus, which I hope you'll tell us a little bit about.
Mhm.
It's a um, a website for information for parents and children of adults with developmental issues and emotional and uh, social issues. So parents can find out a lot just about going to this website before seeing Dr. Karen Wilson. She has a clinic here in Los Angeles with 2 employees where they provide neurological treatment for younger adolescents and adults if adults come to them and they need it. She is a volunteer for UCLA Semel Institute and has lectured at UCLA as a visiting professor several times. She's been featured by the Semel Institute. She is a favorite lecturer across the nation on childhood developmental issues and social and emotional issues from a neurological point of view. And tonight, what she's going to talk to us about is the impact of the pandemic on people with mental health challenges and us too, and also coming out of the pandemic, how to prepare, how to how to relate to coming out of the pandemic after spending so many months and now years of isolation. So I welcome this talented, sensitive, energetic, engaging, and empathic speaker, Dr. Karen Wilson.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Sharon. I really appreciate it. And I just want to thank NAMI Westside LA for inviting me to be a speaker today. And I'm very thrilled to be here. So thank you very much. I do want to say that I'm a neuropsychologist and not a neurologist. So I don't want to misrepresent myself, but we both love the brain. So we're in the same field. So I'm going to share my screen and then kind of talk about where we're going to be going tonight, and then we'll go from there. Can everybody see it okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, you know, talking about children and adolescents is one of my favorite things to do because I believe that we need more attention to learning and emotional challenges that many children and adolescents face. And what's interesting is that during the pandemic, we really got to see a lot of the things that were always there. So I often say that the pandemic kind of lifted the veil on a lot of mental health challenges that were always there, the disparities in our society that were always there, and disparities that actually contribute and exacerbate mental health challenges. So tonight, what I'd like to do is to discuss some social and emotional challenges that many students face and that many have faced over the past 20 months. It's hard to believe that it's been 20 months since the pandemic began. I remember it just like it was yesterday, that March 13th in 2020, when schools shut down and we thought we were going to be, our kids would be home distance learning for a week or two. And now almost 2 years later, we're still in the midst of the pandemic. So we're going to talk about tonight a little bit about how the pandemic has impacted us all, but particularly children and adolescents. And then we're not going to stop there. We're going to talk about how to help kids thrive in this uncertain world. Because I think knowing that there's a problem is one thing, but we also want to know how to support them moving forward. So again, over the past 20 months, it's been, some people would describe it as the perfect storm for children and adolescents, and frankly, for all of us. Over the last 20 months, we've seen political unrest, we've seen a racial justice reckoning, and all in the midst of a global pandemic. And there's some belief, and there's been some movement, and there's been some changes. We've got a vaccine for COVID. We've got a lowered death rates related to COVID. The counts are coming down, but we're definitely not out of the woods. I think before we started, a couple of us were saying, do we see an end to the pandemic? And I do. I see a light at the end of the tunnel, but we still have a ways to go. And in the midst of this, coming at the tail end of what we thought was the end of the pandemic, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and the Children's Hospital Association all came together 2 months ago to declare a national emergency in child and adolescent mental health. And this is at a time where children were back in school, where things were returning to normal, and we're starting to think that things were looking better. And at the same time, we see that a lot of things have improved, but there are still a lot of mental health issues and challenges that we need to address. And we're going to be talking about that tonight. And at the same time, a month later, then on the scene comes a new COVID-19 variant, which is now continuing to impact the mental health of many people as we deal with the uncertainty of what this means for the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to talk about how the pandemic has impacted children and adolescents, how this uncertainty contributes to mental health challenges. We've seen over the past 20 months, there's been isolation, there has been a decrease in physical activity, there's been loneliness, and these things are not new. What we know is that 1 in 5 children in the United States experiences a mental health condition in any given year, and that is pre-pandemic statistics. And what the pandemic has actually done is it has actually exacerbated the mental health challenges, which led to this declaration of a national emergency. When we poll parents, 53% of parents now are saying that they're concerned about their children's mental health. And what we know is that the pandemic has contributed to those concerns. And yes, there is stress related to the uncertainty, to the social isolation, but a lot of children, 140,000 children in the United States, they experienced the loss of a parent or a caregiver or a grandparent during the pandemic. And so there's been fear, there's been grief, there's been loss, and all of these things together has contributed to a lot of the things that we're seeing in our young people right now. Other things to keep in mind is that there's been an uptick in the mental health challenges. Over the last decade, there has been an increase in mental health challenges in our youth. But in the between 2019 and 2021, we've actually seen a 24% increase in the number of mental health emergency room visits for kids between the ages of 5 and 11. And for kids between the ages of 12 and 17, we've seen a 31% increase in visits to the emergency room for mental health issues. Also, we've seen a 60% increase in the rate of suicide in those between the ages of 10 and 24. And this is between 2007 and 2018. This is pre-pandemic statistics. And what we saw post-pandemic is that this stress, these mental health challenges have had a really significant impact on girls in particular, where we've seen a greater than 50% increase in suicide attempts for girls who've shown up to the emergency room. And this is between 2019 and 2021 for girls between the ages of 12 and 17. So you can see how, again, these mental health challenges, this 1 in 5 children who experience a mental health issue is not new. This is pre-pandemic, but the pandemic has exacerbated those difficulties in children and adolescents. And in children of color, what we've seen is that this disparity that we've seen in how the pandemic has impacted physical health, we see it in the mental health realm as well. What we know is from an emergency task force on Black youth suicide and mental health that Black children under the age of 13 are twice as likely to die by suicide among Black youth altogether. And between the ages of 10 and 24, suicide is actually the second leading cause of death for individuals in that age group. And so those statistics are quite alarming when you think about them. We think about our young people, you know, the future of who we are. And we also have to keep in mind that those young people have parents or have caregivers, and those caregivers over the last 20 months have also experienced a significant amount of stress. 75% of adults, whether their parents or not, report not feeling like they had enough support during this time, during the pandemic. About 32% received mental health treatment from a professional during the pandemic, and 24% of those were given a mental health diagnosis for the first time. And so what we have now is you have children and adolescents who are experiencing stress. That stress is contributing to mental health challenges, and they're being parented by adults who are also experiencing their own stressors. And there are a lot of things that we can do. And part of what we need to do is first be aware of what we're seeing and be aware of when children and adolescents are experiencing mental health challenges, are experiencing a crisis in terms of the way that they feel and the way that they are experiencing the world. And the signals for children and adolescents are not always clear. And for particularly young children, they may not have the language to be able to tell you that they are in distress. And so some things that we may think of as behavioral or behavioral problem may actually indicate an underlying mental health issue. So for young children, we might see these emotional outbursts. We may see these temper tantrums that seem to come out of nowhere. We might see regression in behaviors where a child who wasn't bedwetting before is suddenly bedwetting. So those may be indications that something is going on, but they don't automatically alert us to a mental health issue. Children who have difficulty falling asleep, young children who may have had no difficulty sleeping through the night, sleeping in their own rooms, in their beds, may suddenly be up during the night, coming into a parent's bedroom, have difficulty falling asleep, waking up, may wake up in the middle of the night. So these might be some signs that there might be something else going on. We may also see, particularly when we think about anxiety, nervousness, worry, or stress, children complaining of stomach aches or headaches or not feeling well or avoiding things that they would normally want to do. Even in the midst of a pandemic, we might see compulsive hand washing, compulsive mask wearing, even when, for example, children are at home with their family members. And so all of these things can indicate signs that there is something going on a social or emotional level that may indicate that there's a problem. Some things to keep in mind is that, you know, children, anyone can experience a behavioral or a mental health challenge at any point in their lifetime, but children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable. And when we think about young children and we think about anxiety in particular, the age of onset for an anxiety disorder, and we'll talk about what that looks like, is they typically tend to emerge around age 6. And so that's younger than what we would typically think about when we think about mental health challenges for children and adolescents. Behavioral disorders, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant behaviors, tend to emerge right around age 11. Mood disorders, when we think about depression, bipolar disorder, mood dysregulation, sometimes those symptoms begin to start to emerge by age 13. And then substance use disorders tend to emerge right around age 15. And again, this is just an average. Sometimes it's earlier and sometimes it's later. But these are things to keep in mind when we're seeing some of the things I talked about before. And you see them occurring in a 6-year-old who can't fall asleep at night, who might be showing some regression, that it could be signs of anxiety. Now, there are a number of risk factors for mental health challenges. And what we know is that if a child has a family history of a mood disorder, of anxiety disorders, of psychiatric disorders, they're at greater likelihood and a greater risk for having those disorders when they become adults and for displaying symptoms when they're younger. Stress is also a risk factor. Children who are exposed to chronic stress, stress that they can't really control, stress that persists over an extended period of time, are at greater risk for developing mental health challenges. Children with attention problems, learning problems, particularly when they are unrecognized, undiagnosed, not identified. These are children who are struggling and people don't know why. And when they don't know why, they don't know how to support them. Oftentimes that can lead to depression and anxiety in children and adolescents, and also acting out behaviors as well. Abuse, neglect, the loss of a parent or a caregiver in adolescence, the breakup of a romantic relationship, and other traumas can also contribute to, can be risk factors for the development of mental health challenges. So when we think about mental health challenges in children and adolescents, there are a number of them. And I want to talk about some that are particularly frequent and have been kind of showing up, and children have been exhibiting a lot of these disorders, symptoms of the disorder. And anxiety is one of those. We talked about the fact that the emergence of anxiety disorders can occur as young as age 6. And what we know about anxiety is that in small amounts, it's adaptive, it's healthy, it keeps us safe because we need to be alert in terms of the environments that we are in. There are things that we need to be afraid of. We need to be able to flee when we need to flee a situation that can be detrimental to our health and our well-being. But it becomes problematic when we worry, when that worry becomes excessive, when it's very frequent, when it's distressing, and when it keeps us from doing things we would normally want to do. So when a child doesn't want to go to school, doesn't want to visit grandma, doesn't want to leave the house, these are situations where the anxiety is out of proportion to the situation and may indicate an anxiety disorder. And in children and adolescents, those symptoms are often difficult to manage, and it impacts their day-to-day functioning because they can't do the things and enjoy the things that you would want them to enjoy on a day-to-day basis. And when kids are really young, they may have difficulty articulating what it is that they're experiencing. And even though older kids may be able to identify that they're worried, they can't control that worry. They can't control that anxiety. And that alone can contribute to distress because they don't know what to do about the feelings that they're experiencing. Now, what does anxiety look like in children and adolescents? It can look very different in different children, and it can look different depending on the age of the child. It can look like restlessness. It can look like a child who can't sit still. And sometimes that can get confused with ADHD. And so that's why it's also important to make sure that if there is an issue and you don't know what it is, that you consult with a mental health professional that can help you figure out the reason why a child is exhibiting some of the behaviors that you're seeing, because obviously if it's ADHD, it's going to have a different treatment than anxiety. Fatigue is often another red flag for kids with anxiety, because oftentimes they're not getting enough sleep at night because they're worrying, they can't fall asleep, or they're worried in school, they're hypervigilant, it's taking up a lot of energy, and they're fatigued, they're really exhausted. They can look easily distracted. Again, we talked about difficulties with sleep and those somatic symptoms where they're complaining of headaches and stomach aches. And if there is anxiety about school, it's usually happening on Sunday night, when they know they have to go to school on Monday morning. And all of these difficulties with anxiety and worry and can contribute to difficulties with focusing, because if kids are worrying, it's very hard to think and to participate in a learning environment when you're afraid. So anxiety is one challenge that many children face. It's a mental health issue for many children and adolescents and for many adults. And I often describe depression as anxiety's, sibling or anxiety's cousin, because there's a lot of overlap between the symptoms of anxiety and depression, and they often coexist in kids and in young people who have anxiety. And when we think about the fatigue I talked about, the distractibility, the restlessness, disturbances in sleep, those are also seen in kids and adolescents who are depressed. And the difference with depression is that there's often this persistent feeling of sadness, this feeling of emptiness, this feeling of not wanting to do things that they may have wanted to do in the past. So a lack of interest, a lack of ability to experience pleasure in activities that previously might have brought joy to them and bring joy to their peers. And in children, it's interesting because oftentimes children might not say the word sad. They may not say the word emptiness, feelings of emptiness, but they may say things like, I'm bored, right? And oftentimes we may just, tell children, well, there's a lot of things for you to do. There's no reason for you to be bored. But sometimes they don't have the language to articulate what it is they're experiencing, but they know the word bored. And bored means that they don't want to do X, Y, and Z, but that also can indicate that there is a mood issue for that particular child. Sometimes the sadness can manifest as irritability, where sometimes parents feel like they're walking on eggshells around their children because they don't know how they're going to react. They may have a big reaction or a bigger reaction that is disproportionate to the situation at hand. And that can actually be seen in kids who are anxious as well. And what we know about kids who struggle in school, whether that be because of learning challenges, because of attention, processing issues, language challenges, other neurodevelopmental issues, is that they are at increased risk for anxiety, and they're also at increased risk for depression. And what we know also about depression and anxiety is that they not only impact a child's emotional functioning and their social functioning, their ability to connect with their peers, but it also affects their ability to learn. And I gave the example of anxiety and how it's really hard to think when you're afraid, but it's hard to be motivated to be in a classroom and to learn when you're depressed. One of the things that is a contributing factor to both depression and anxiety is loneliness. And loneliness itself is not a mental health condition, but many studies have found that loneliness actually increases the risk of anxiety and depression in children and adolescents. And what we've seen over the past 20 months is that children have been isolated from their peers. And even though things have opened up in terms of schools opening up, a lot of children aren't doing the things that they did before. They may not be having play dates, they may not be visiting friends because of issues related to COVID. And so there's still a significant amount of loneliness that the students are experiencing. They're missing that in-person connection that they had pre-pandemic. And I have to say that even before the pandemic, loneliness has been an issue. And in 2018, there was a study that came out, and they reported that loneliness is actually had reached crisis levels in 2018, where they felt that loneliness was a risk factor for mortality, and it was rivaling obesity, that individuals who were significantly lonely over an extended period of time had the same risk for mortality as individuals who were smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And so loneliness, because it again increases anxiety, increases the risk for depression, can contribute significantly to mental health challenges in children and adolescents. And the other thing about loneliness to keep in mind is that it doesn't occur in a vacuum. Yes, the social isolation associated with the pandemic has created some loneliness. And oftentimes we think that if we find ways for our young people to connect, and that will decrease the loneliness. And social media is supposed to be one of those tools that allows children to connect, even when they were physically isolated. But what the research showed even before the pandemic was that media use has actually been linked to loneliness. And so that same device and those same portals and platforms that are supposed to enhance connection and enhance community can actually contribute to loneliness in adolescence. And we've seen some of the research that has come out recently regarding platforms like Instagram and how that contributes to mental health challenges, particularly in girls. Feelings of loneliness have also been associated with sleep disruption, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And it's children and adolescents who are experiencing depression, who are experiencing anxiety, and we're concerned about them. But we're also concerned about those emerging adults. And those are in young people between the ages of 18 and 24, where we think that they are full-fledged adults, when in fact their brains are continuing to develop. And between the ages of 18 and 24, neurodevelopment is continuing. Their brains are continuing to develop, and the front part of the brain is actually not going to be fully developed and fully formed until individuals are in their mid-20s. And during this period of emerging adulthood, what we know is that a lot of young people are at greater risk for depression, they're at greater risk for anxiety, and it's often the time when psychiatric issues begin to emerge. Those symptoms of schizophrenia, of bipolar disorder begin to emerge right around that time period of emerging adulthood. And this is happening at the same time when they don't have a fully developed frontal lobe. And what does the frontal lobe do? It's responsible for our ability to regulate our emotions. It's responsible for our ability to problem solve, our ability to use good judgment and to make good decisions. And so you can see how, again, we've got this perfect storm of vulnerability from mental health challenges without a fully developed frontal lobe, which allows us to cope with stress by using those problem-solving techniques, by using good judgment so that we can make good decisions. And so our young people, at a time when we think that we need to be more hands-off because they are becoming adults, sometimes we need to continue to be hands-on. And the research actually supports that young adults between the ages of 18 and 24 still need that parental support. They still need societal support as they are continuing to develop. Again, because of the risk for psychiatric issues during that time period, and the fact that even though they are being asked to do a lot of things in the role of an adult, they are operating with an underdeveloped brain that still needs time in order to be in full effect and be fully recognized and realized, so that they can use those wiring to be able to, again, organize and plan, make good decisions, exercise good judgment, but they're not there yet, and they need time. So what we know is that children, when they are mentally, emotionally, and behaviorally stable, they do better in life. They do better in school. And when they're young people, they avoid risky decisions and risky behaviors, like abusing substances, like engaging in risky sexual behaviors. And overall, their well-being is enhanced. And what we need to do is to be able to support our young people as they are facing difficulties, whether that be stressors in their environment, the emergence of anxiety or depressive symptoms, the emergence of significant psychiatric issues, and we can do that. We know that there are experts in the field that are well equipped to help our young people, to help our children, to help adolescents deal with difficulties, deal with depression, deal with anxiety, deal with stressors. There are evidence-based treatments that work very well to address those issues, but we have to make sure that children and adolescents are getting the support that they need. So absolutely, when we see some of the things that I've described, those symptoms of anxiety, of depression, of other psychiatric issues, of significant stressors, we do want to make sure that we are getting those children and adolescents the support that they need. But it's not up to just the professionals to support them. Yes, it's important, but there are things that we can do parents can do and teachers can do and community members can do to buffer against the stressors of life and to build resilience in our children and adolescents, in our young people. And so I'd like to spend some time talking about those things, because oftentimes we might feel that a lot of things are out of our control. We don't have control over the pandemic. We don't have control over the stressors. I've talked to a lot of parents who say they don't have control over what's going to happen on a day-to-day basis. They're on pins and needles because they don't know when the school's going to call and say, we have a COVID case, your kids have to go home and be quarantined for 10 days. So we're still dealing with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stressors that don't seem to be going away anytime soon. And again, you know, we're in a national state of emergency with respect to child and adolescent mental health. So what can we do to enhance the resilience and build our children's resilience during this uncertain time, during these uncertain times, as we prepare for a post-pandemic world? And we're all hoping that it comes sooner than later. One of the things we know from research is that one of the best ways to build resilience in children and adolescents is to build relationships. We know that connection with an adult who is nurturing, who is consistently there, who listens, can contribute significantly to a child's resilience. Children and adolescents want to know that they have someone to go to who will listen to them, someone who they can talk to about what it is that they're feeling, and can talk to about why they're experiencing the feelings that they are having. They don't necessarily want an adult to come in and fix it, but they want to know that they are being heard and that someone is there to be with them, to connect with them, to empathize with them, and to validate what it is that they're experiencing. And so again, one of the things that we can do is to form those relationships, to spend that time with a child, with an adolescent, one-on-one in small groups, and make sure that those connections are formed and that we're spending the time to further develop and enhance and nurture those relationships, because they are essential for building resilience. What other things that we can, what are some other things that we can do? During this time, during the pandemic, I think the research showed that 40% of adults were saying that they were not getting enough sleep because of stress factors. What we know about sleep is that it is absolutely essential to well-being. We spend as individuals about 1/3 of our lives in a state of sleep, yet 70% of kids and adults get insufficient sleep. And sleep is critical to emotional well-being. It's critical for children who are learning in a school environment. We need sleep in order to be alert during a school day, to pay attention to our environment. We need sleep, a good night's sleep, to be able to regulate our emotions. When we are sleeping, that is the time when children and adolescents are converting all the things that they've learned and are storing in their short-term memory into long-term memory. So when we don't get enough sleep, it can actually contribute to forgetfulness, and it can contribute to mental health challenges in individuals who are consistently not getting enough sleep. And that has been the issue for a number of children, a number of adolescents, and frankly, a number of adults, that we're just not getting enough sleep. And that is contributing to behavioral problems in children, oftentimes the acting out behaviors that we see in school, the difficulties with emotional regulation, the outbursts. Many of those issues can be addressed with ensuring that children get a good night's sleep. What the research shows us is that insufficient sleep in school-age children is associated, again, with problems with attention, difficulties with alertness, daytime sleepiness, problems with executive functioning, all of those frontal lobe areas that I talked about before, the ability to organize, the ability to plan, the ability to make good decisions, the ability to problem solve. All of those things we don't do well when we're not getting enough sleep. And if we are to cope with stressors in our environment, we have to be able to rely on our problem-solving abilities. We have to be able to make good decisions. And children and adolescents who are struggling and not getting enough sleep can't even really ask for the help that they need, because that's a decision they have to make. They have to make the decision to actually ask for the help that they need. So what that often looks like is a meltdown, an outburst, acting out behaviors, slamming doors, refusals, or avoidance. And one of the easy fixes, it's not going to solve everything, is to first track to make sure kids are getting enough sleep, and then to actually make sure that you're implementing good sleep habits in a child's day. We also know, in addition to difficulties with mental health and problems with emotions and emotional regulation, obviously difficulties with sleep can contribute to academic struggles. And those academic struggles, when a child is not doing well academically, again, that can contribute to anxiety and depression. So again, we can address a lot of the difficulties by making sure that kids are getting enough sleep. And how much sleep do kids need? And when I talk about how much sleep the kids need, they need more than we think. And when we look at what the sleep guidelines are, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the American Academy of Pediatrics, they're all reporting that, children between the ages of 3 and 5 need about 10 to 13 hours of sleep. That's a big range, but the younger the child is, the more sleep that they need. Children between the ages of 6 and 12 need about 9 to 12 hours of sleep. A 7 to 9-year-old needs about 11 hours of sleep. That drops to about 10 hours of sleep for children between the ages of 10 and 12. And even teenagers, when we think that they don't need as much sleep, they're staying up late, they're engaging in a lot of extracurricular activities. Parents have reported they go to bed at midnight, at 1 a.m., they're getting up early for school. They actually need between 8 and 10 hours of sleep nightly for optimal health, for optimal well-being. And so this is one of the reasons why a lot of schools have adopted later start times for school, because they found that mental health was enhanced, academic performance improved, and overall well-being of children improved when they were getting enough sleep. But so when we think about what we can do to support a child and adolescent's mental health, what we know is that, one, we want to, again, connect with them, build those relationships, nurture those relationships. But the other thing we want to do is make sure that they're getting enough sleep. Tied to sleep is screen media exposure. And what we know during the pandemic is that a lot of children, a lot of adolescents, a lot of adults were using screens excessively. Kids were not able to connect with their peers. They were not able to have in-person interactions. The only way that they could connect was to be on their screens, Google Hangouts, Zoom. The school was on their screens. And because they weren't engaging in extracurricular activities like sports and other things that they would normally do in person, they were spending a lot of time on screens. And what we know pre-pandemic is that high use of screens, higher levels of screen time has been associated with delays in development, particularly in young children, inattention, behavioral problems, and poor mental health. There's been a lot of research showing that excessive screen media exposure contributes to and exacerbates mental health challenges in children and adolescents. And no surprise, it also contributes to poor sleep, because children are staying up late on their screens, either texting, watching YouTube videos, playing video games. They're not getting enough sleep. And then again, that's contributing to mental health challenges. We know if we look at very young children, we know that the research is showing us that children between the ages of 2 and 5 who spend a lot of time on screens, it's associated with lower developmental outcomes. When they look at those developmental milestones in terms of cognitive development, social emotional development, there are lower outcomes in children who are exposed to screens, particularly for longer periods of time when they're younger. Some researchers also showing that kids who are exposed to screens early on have more difficulties with emotional regulation, because they haven't learned how to self-soothe. It's really interesting, because before screens and before iPads and before cell phones, when a child was having a meltdown, the parents would go down on their knees, get in their child's face, and soothe their child. But what has happened is that when that happens, now parents are handing their children an iPhone, an iPad with images on it, and that calms the child down. But what that has done, it has taught children that they can't self-soothe, that they rely on this device to monitor their mood. And so there's newer research coming out, and it's going to be interesting to see what that looks like in the years to come. But a lot of research is showing that it's impacting the development of a child's brain when we do that. Another study has found that preschoolers who had more than 2 hours of screen time a day had increased risk of attention problems, of externalizing behaviors, acting out behaviors by the time they were in elementary school. So all of those things, again, if you think about a child who is acting out, who's getting in trouble because of, factors including excessive screen time, then they are getting in trouble. They're getting the message from educators that they're doing something wrong, and that in turn can contribute to mental health challenges. But again, one of the things that we can do is we can limit screen exposure. We don't have to allow kids to spend excessive amounts of time on screens. Those are things that we have control over. We have control over the relationship that we develop with our children, with the students in our classrooms, with the kids in our communities. We have control over, as parents, how much sleep our kids get, how much exposure they get to screens. And it's not just the young children. What we also know is that adolescents, and those are the kids, the young people who spend a lot of time on screens. Those who spend more time on screens are more likely to report depression, and they're more likely to report experiencing suicidal thoughts and engaging in suicidal behaviors, compared to their peers who spend more time on non-screen activities. So those are children who spend more time on in-person social interactions, sports, exercise, even reading print media, attending religious services. So the adolescents who spend more time on screens have poorer mental health outcomes compared to those who engage and spend more time on non-screen related activities. And again, when we think about building resilience and building our children's ability to cope with challenges and have good mental health outcomes, these are things that we have control over and that we can change very easily. When we think about media exposure, again, one of the things I mentioned is that media exposure impacts sleep. And again, and I'm going to say it over and over again, sleep is essential, not only for learning, not only for academic performance, but it's essential for mental health. An individual who's already experiencing a psychiatric issue, depression, anxiety, other mental health challenges, those things are exacerbated when individuals are not getting enough sleep. Those symptoms are worsened when individuals are also getting insufficient sleep. So we can support children and adolescents by making sure they're getting enough sleep. We're limiting their screen media exposure. We're supporting them with our connections with them. We also want to make sure that they're getting enough physical activity. A lot of students who stopped playing sports during the pandemic spent more time on screens. And we want to make sure that they're engaging in physical activity. We know the benefits in terms of physical outcomes for children and adolescents, and for adults for that matter, with exercise. There are significant physical outcome benefits to exercise, but there are also mental health benefits. We know that exercise improves mood. We know that being in nature improves mood. So if you can exercise outside, it's even better. We know that when children engage in physical activity, even before they go and do an academic task or a cognitive task, their performance is actually enhanced if they do an aerobic activity right before that academic or that cognitive task. And we know that even a few minutes, 5 minutes of moderate exercise can have a mood enhancing effect. And so if we think about supporting the mental health of children and adolescents, we want to make sure that they are getting enough physical activity in their day-to-day lives. And that means 60 minutes or more of daily physical activity in the moderate range of activity. When we think about that physical activity, yes, it's great to be outside and to go for those walks. And one of the things I mentioned was to go outside for walks in nature has a double enhancing effect, because we know that nature and physical exercise impacts mood and enhances mood. But there's also an added benefit when children can actually engage in organized sports as part of that physical activity. Because when you're playing organized sports, you're actually developing those executive functioning skills that I mentioned before. And so they're building on those skills for organizing and for planning and for inhibiting their impulses and for making decisions and for regulating their emotions. All of those abilities are getting strengthened when kids are playing sports, when young people are playing sports. And when they're engaged in sports activities, when they have teammates in those organized sports, it actually has a bonding experience for them as well. So they're getting their needs met in terms of connection, in terms of relationships, and that social bonding can actually mitigate against stress. And so again, we want to support kids and give them lots of opportunities to engage in physical activity, but we know that sports activities in particular have an added benefit of enhancing executive functioning skills and enhancing those bonding relationships between peers. One of the other things that we can do to build resilience in children and adolescents and our young people is to really take the time to nurture a growth mindset in children and adolescents. So what do we mean by a growth mindset? Carol Dweck is a researcher, and she's done a lot of research in this area, and other researchers have also looked at this. And what they found is that those children who have a growth mindset, and what that means is that they have the belief that things can change and that people have the potential to change, that things do not have to always stay the same, and that with support, with a little hard work, with the support of individuals to help them get from A to B, to overcome challenges, that their situation can change, that things can get better. Versus a fixed mindset is the child, the adolescent, the adult who feels that things will never be this, will always be this way. They're not going to change. They're not going to get better. There's nothing we can do to change the situation. And so what we know is that there are better mental health outcomes. Children are more likely to show resilience when they're facing adversity, when they're facing challenges, when they have a growth mindset. Because when they adopt that growth mindset, when they face a challenge, when they face adversity, they have the belief that things can change. It's not always going to be hard. This is not always going to be difficult. Things can change, and there are things that I can do either by myself or with the support of another person to help the situation get better. And so helping children to adopt a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset can have a significant impact on building a child's resilience. It has a significant impact on overall well-being, the self-efficacy in terms of a child, self-esteem in terms of how a child or an adolescent feels about themselves. And they've also shown that it actually enhances academic performance, enhances relationships, peer relationships, because children believe that, if someone was mean to them, that doesn't always have to be the case, and that things can change, and that they have some control over their situation, and that there are things that can be done to improve the situation. So that's another thing that we can do when we think about building the resilience of children and adolescents, is to help children to adopt a growth mindset as opposed to having a fixed mindset. So when we think about all the things that the children have faced, we think about the 1 in 5 children who experience a mental health challenge. We think about the fact that these mental health issues have been enhanced or made worse by this global pandemic. What we also know is that we have to look at this as perhaps an opportunity. And Benjamin Franklin said, out of adversity comes opportunity. And if we think about adversity, the situation of this pandemic, of all of the things that have happened over the last 20 months that I talked about at the beginning of this discussion, the political unrest, the racial justice reckoning, the pandemic, and all of the things that have happened, how can we think about what do I mean when we think about opportunity? Why would I pull up this particular quote? I think about that in the context of building resilience. We have the opportunity to build resilience in our young people at this particular time, so that not only can they get through the current challenge that they're facing, the adversity that they're facing right now, but they're better equipped to deal with challenges, with adversity in the future. And so if we do these things, if we're mindful of all of these things that we can do to build resilience, all of these things can be a buffer against the stressors of life. And these stressors are things that can actually contribute to mental health challenges. But if we can buffer against those things and provide students and children and adolescents with the support that they need, we can definitely see a difference in the way that they're able to overcome challenges that they face in the future and have an overall and enhanced well-being. So when we think about what parents can do, teachers can do, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, neighbors can do to support children and adolescents, there are a number of things that we can do. And I've kind of summarized them here so we can kind of look at the fact that there's so much that we can do. We can prioritize relationships and connection. We can prioritize sleep and a well-balanced diet. Those are things that we can do right now. We can limit screen time. We can empower children and adolescents. We can do that by, again, nurturing that relationship, listening to them, hearing their feelings, hearing their concerns, validating what it is that they're experiencing, nurturing a growth mindset, and helping them to develop those executive functioning skills by helping them to problem solve, to organize, to regulate their emotions. And a lot of that development of those executive functioning skills comes from modeling, by showing them how to do different things. Because the one thing we know about resilience, and we know this over the last 10 years, is that it can be taught. And that is really exciting. We can teach kids to become more resilient. And when we do that, we can actually change the wiring of their brains so that when, again, they are presented with challenges in their future, their brain is well equipped to deal with those challenges and deal with it in a way that doesn't result in significant stressors impacting their ability to interact with other people, to have day-to-day experiences and that they want to have, and to have, again, to enhance their overall well-being. We want to minimize stress. We can do that by mindfulness practices, adopting mindfulness practices. Again, I talked about getting outdoors, engaging in physical activity. We want to build empathy. There's a lot of research on gratitude. When individuals adopt gratitude practices and thinking about all the things in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of adversity and challenge that they can be grateful for, that practice actually enhances well-being. And there's research to show that it actually changes the wiring of their brain as well. So we can help individuals, children and adolescents experience more joy, express gratitude, build empathy. And one of the things we have to keep in mind is that as we try to navigate these uncertain times and prepare for this post-pandemic world, that we give ourselves some grace while we're trying to do it all. Because overnight, we're not going to ensure that all our kids are getting enough sleep, that we're limiting screen time, that we're helping them adopt a growth mindset. We do a little bit at a time. We do the best that we can with the goal of doing all that we can to support the mental health of children and adolescents. The other thing that we can do is really to support mental health initiatives. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Children and Adolescent Psychiatry, and the Children's Hospital Associations have all urged policymakers to increase federal funding to make sure that all families have access to mental health services, that we have screening so that we can identify kids who are at risk for mental health challenges, for psychiatric issues early on, so that we can get in there and provide that early intervention that we know results in better outcomes later on. We want to make sure that we're continuing with telemedicine and telehealth practices so that more people can have access to the mental health services that they need. We want to make sure that we have parity of physical and mental health, that there's mental health support in schools, and that we're making sure, again, that we are prepared as a society to support children and adolescents. And what we know is that by making sure that children and adolescents get the support that they need, we can ensure that as adults, that they are healthy, they're resilient, and they're productive. And so there are a lot of things that we can do to support the mental health and the development of our children and adolescents. We just have to be willing to seek the support for them in terms of the experts when we need to, support the initiatives for mental health in our society, and to do what we can as community members, as parents, as caregivers, to support the mental health of the children and adolescents in our lives. Thank you so much, and I'm open to answer any questions you might have.
Yes, thank you, Karen, for this illuminating talk on how to create resilient, healthy children that will be able to make positive choices for their adult life. So thank you so much. And I want to open it up to any questions for Karen.
Well, I have a question. Dr. Wilson, thank you. That was so hopeful and inspiring and informative, incredible. And as I was admitting to Aaron, it was a little depressing for me because I was thinking, I have a son who diagnosed with bipolar disorder at 18 after a pretty severe manic episode. And there were so many warning signs of that we were going through. And I was like, I know we did what we could, but there was like medication was recommended earlier in his journey, and we didn't do that. Do you think, and I'm not asking to, because I want to beat myself up more, but could his mania have been prevented if he'd been treated differently or maybe medicated earlier?
Well, first I'll say, I don't beat yourself up over it. I think a lot of people overlook signs because we don't know. Parents are not experts in symptoms in terms of knowing what is depression, what is just a bad mood, what is just being irritable because of a bad day. And so a lot of parents are not equipped to kind of diagnose their children or to understand what it is that they're seeing. And what we know about bipolar disorder is that it's neurological, it's biological. And if a child, an adolescent, is going to develop bipolar disorder, they're going to develop it. So there's nothing that you could have done to prevent a manic episode. And it sounds like when you did realize that your child was experiencing symptoms that turned out to be bipolar disorder, that you were ultimately able to provide the support that they needed. And what I often say is it's never too late to provide the support that children or even young adults need, because they'll always need the support at some point in their lives.
Well, that's what really came through loud and clear. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions here? Any other questions for?
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I had a question about diet, more about, I listened to this, it was on Instagram, Dr. Amen the other day. It was all about red dye in like red vines and how a child has a piece of red licorice or some blue dye or Oreo cookies or what sugar and whatnot. You didn't touch upon a lot of diet. What is your opinion on diet?
I would say that we want to make sure that kids have a well-balanced diet. We want to follow the health guidelines in terms of diet. Kids are not eating, they're eating too much processed food. They're not eating enough fruits and vegetables. And so it's less about monitoring dye and more about making sure the diet is balanced and they're getting enough of the antioxidants, they're getting water on a regular basis. A lot of kids are showing symptoms because they're dehydrated, chronically dehydrated. They're not getting enough water. They're drinking juice and soda instead of water. They have too much sugar in their diet. And so that's what I would say with respect to diet. A bad diet doesn't cause mental health challenges, but it can contribute to behavioral issues with attention problems, mood regulation issues, particularly in kids who are and in individuals who are more sensitive.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
So anybody else have a question for Dr. Wilson? Your talk was just marvelous and so thorough and helped us understand what's needed to create resilience and as our children are growing up.
Oh, thank
Sorry,
you, Sharon.
I put my question in the chat box.
Oh.
And Druhi, what is your question?
In the chat box, please.
Sure,
Okay.
I see it. I can relay that question, and Ruhi.
Okay.
She asks, how can we work on our relationship with her 13-year-old granddaughter?
Okay. So that's very broad in terms of what that means. But I think one place to start is one-on-one time. I think that all of us could spend more one-on-one time with the people in our lives. And that's not time watching TV side by side. That is really spending the time so you can listen, so you can talk. It might be going for a walk. It might be playing a board game. It might be sharing insight regarding a book you're reading, have a book club with your granddaughter, read the same book, talk about it, go for walks, join, like do a Zumba class together, all of these things and these activities that again enhance connection. And when you do those things, you want to, again, you're showing support, you're forming that connection, you're solidifying that connection, you're nurturing, and you're developing that relationship. So all the things that you can do to nurture that relationship, to listen to what your granddaughter's feeling, experiencing, sharing experiences, all of those things are going to be important. Think about empathizing with the experience of your granddaughter. If she's having a bad day, validating what it is that she experienced during that day and oftentimes as adults, we want to go in and fix it, but asking what would be helpful to you right now? What do you need from me right now? And because I want to be here, and just oftentimes just letting a child, a grandchild know that you're there is enough, right? And so again, all the things that you can do to enhance that relationship and that communication is really important.
Very good answer. Very good answer. Anybody else have a question for Dr. Wilson?
Should we, I'm sorry, let me finish my question. Should we just praise them a lot for everything that they do, or that's a limit?
Yes. Okay. That's a really good question, because oftentimes what the research shows that we want to praise, we don't want to overpraise for everything, right? So we want to really be selective in terms of what we're praising. And then we also don't want to praise only the good outcomes. For example, if a child is working hard at school and they get like a perfect score on a test, oftentimes we want to praise them for doing so well. But what we want to do is to praise the effort, right? That's more important than praising the outcome, because that's something that they have control over, right? They have control over how much time they spend fostering a relationship with a friend, or studying for a test, or practicing that basketball move or that volleyball move that they've learned. But they don't have any control over how good they're going to be, what the score of the game is going to be, what they're ultimately going to get on that test. So what we know is that praising the effort, praising is really important and goes a long way.
Thank you very much.
So
That's
much
very
sense.
You're
helpful.
welcome.
Yeah, to praise the process
Yes.
rather than praise the outcome, because they can't control the outcome.
Right.
So that's so important. Thank you for that. So any other questions here for her?
I had a question. Am I muted?
No, I can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. So I have a question. You had the slide on the development of the brain,
Mm-hmm.
and you looked at, a child, an adolescent, pre-adolescent, adult. And how do you look at the development of the brain
Mm-hmm.
on a continuum when you're looking at a child or adolescent, so that you can see the development of the brain and know the best interventions given
Mm-hmm.
the development of the brain and their ability to be able to be helped given
Right.
where they are along the continuum of brain development?
Yeah. So for me, it was 12 years of school, right? But most people don't have that information. And so you don't know. And so that's really important. That's one of the reasons why I do a lot of these talks, because oftentimes we see teens and they're making really poor decisions. And if we think about our own experience as adolescents, we didn't always make the right decisions. And even though we were approaching adulthood, and it's not because of, this chronic bad judgment, it's because that part of the brain that's responsible for judgment and decision making is not fully developed. And so when we think about, there are certain things that kids can do just as well as adults when they're really young. If you think about an adult running across the room and a 5-year-old running across the room, they both look exactly the same because the motor system is fully developed. The 5-year-old might even be a little bit faster, but you wouldn't expect, for example, a 15-year-old to plan your trip to New York, because you're probably going to miss your flight, you won't have a connection, or you won't even have a hotel when you get there, because that part of the brain that's responsible for organization and planning isn't fully developed. So one of the things you can do is kind of look at, there've been lots of charts about developmental milestones in terms of what is expected in terms of what children, adolescents should be able to do. But when we think about those higher level things, again, I said judgment, decision-making, problem-solving, planning, students all the way into their mid-20s still need support, some more than others. And if a child has a learning disability, like an ADHD or dyslexia, there's often a 3-year delay in the development of those skills. So sometimes we're sending a child with ADHD off to college at 18, but their frontal lobe is actually 15 years old. And so those are things to keep in mind as well.
Can any types of scans or psych testing kind of give you the look at where the brain development is?
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting because not scans so much, because a lot of it is really kind of those microscopic connections between brain cells that results in the efficiency with different brain pathways. But if there's an area of difficulty, or you think that, hey, this child should be able to organize and should be able to plan, all their peers can, but my child's stuff is falling out of the backpack, they're forgetting all their homework every night, they're having a hard time regulating their emotions, and I feel like, their peers can do this, but they're struggling, then that would be a time to kind of look into maybe an evaluation to see where a child is in terms of their development relative to their same age peers.
I think all of the audience tonight that has a adult child or a child with a mental health challenge wish they had met you when the child was young. Wish they had brought the child to you, Dr. Wilson, for an evaluation when they were young. Because we might have, none of us knew. So but
Yeah.
we might have staved
Most people don't. Most people don't.
Yeah, here I was a therapist, and my child was becoming anorexic, and I just thought she was a really hostile teenager.
Yeah.
I miss the anorexia altogether because she wore so many coats. I didn't see it and I didn't think about it. And I am a therapist. I mean, I identify these issues with young people too. So it's real easy to lose your way raising a child and not noticing, what might be needed, what might be helpful psychologically or emotionally. So thank you. You've really illuminated for us.
You're so welcome. And there's no perfect parent. I've never met one. I don't know any. And, we all just do the best that we can. And
I agree with that.
And once we have more information, we can do things a little bit differently. And it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yes. I've always said a lot of parents are great with toddlers. Some parents are great with elementary school kids. Some parents are the best when they can go to soccer games and do sports with their kids. Some mothers are best when they can take their young adult daughters shopping. We're all good in spots as parents.
Yes.
Nobody's good all the way through.
No.
So I agree with
no
you,
one.
Mr. Wilson. So I want to thank you so much for coming tonight and giving us this presentation. It will be on YouTube. Let's give her a round of applause. It will be on our YouTube through our NAMI website, namila.org. And I just really appreciate you sharing your evening with us from Canada. I really appreciate you very much. And I just want to mention our next speaker in January Our next speaker in January is Dr. Michael Levitin. Michael Levitin is a PhD who's been helping people learn to manage anger and their impulses when they get angry for years. He spoke for us in 2011. He spoke for us in 2009 when we used to have those big conferences. And the courts have been ordering people in jail diversionary programs to go to Dr. Levitin to manage anger. So the title of his talk in January 8th, we won't be starting January 1st, which is the first Wednesday in January, but January 8th, anger management with mental health challenges in the family. So he will be very interesting and very informative too, like Dr. Wilson has been tonight. Erin, did you want to say any last things as we approach the holiday season?
Well, just that I'm very, very grateful for this presentation, Dr. Karen Wilson, and for having you as a board member.
Oh, thank
Yeah,
you.
we're so grateful to have you as a member of our community, and thank you for presenting this evening. As a mom of 2 young children and having to navigate homeschool and
Oh,
just everything that's been going on too with the pandemic, it was so helpful to hear a lot of those helpful tips and see some of the just tangible tools that you can use on a daily basis. So I really appreciate that. Also, just as a quick reminder, I sent it in the chat at the beginning of the meeting, but there is an event on December 6th. It's called Cut Out Stigma. So our members can go to a hair salon, local hair salon in Culver City, and get a free haircut. So it's just a little way to say thank you to our members during this holiday season.
So do we make appointments for that, or just do we show up?
And maybe Steph, could you put the flyer back in the or let's see, I can do it again. But
Ideally, we sign up for slots, Sharon, but you can also just show up.
yeah, you can just show up.
I'll make sure they fit you in. You want to just show up.
On the flyer and on our website, we sent out an email today with all the information where you can sign up, and they're 20-minute increments. And then also, I just want to thank Dorit for making this introduction to Dr. Karen Wilson and to Janice Black Warner for having these presentations and sponsoring them so we can have wonderful speakers like yourself. So thank
wonderful.
you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all. That was brilliant, Dr. Wilson. And I think maybe we should have our NAMI Westside LA. We should do an organized